Hey everybody, how's it going? Coming to y'all with another deck tech, and this one is on Unesh, Criosphinx Sovereign. Before I jump into this one, I want to go ahead and give a shout out to Fox Noctum, as he was the inspiration behind this deck. My wife and I loved watching his videos back when he created content. Still very sad that he's no longer doing so. And she saw his SEAL Team Sphinx deck, and she thought it was so cool. And she asked me, hey, is Sphinx Tribal actually viable in Commander? And I told her that I felt Unesh was actually a kind of slept-on commander, kind of underrated, and that I thought he could generate tons of card advantage, and he would be very viable. And she asked me to go ahead and put a list together for it, so that's what we have today. And it's all thanks to Fox Noctum. So Fox, if you're watching this, thanks, man. So let's go ahead and delve into it. Unesh is 4 and 2 blue for a 4/4 Sphinx with flying. Sphinxes you cast cost 2 less to cast, and when a Sphinx ETBs, including Unesh, you reveal the top 4 cards of your library and an opponent separates them into 2 piles. You take one of them, put it in your hand, and then the other pile then goes to the graveyard. So, kind of a fact or fiction on ETB for every Sphinx. Not 5 cards, just 4, but very, very close. It's between a Jace Architect of Thought and a fact or fiction. And that generates insane card advantage. The Unesh deck very often has 20, 30 cards in hand, and of course, you find your Thought Vessel or your Reliquary Tower so you don't have to discard. But as a result, all of those cards that the Unesh player has in hand tends to give them answers to anything that'll be happening on the board. Board wipes, counter spells, spot removal, and honestly, it's just a very solid tribal list. So, that is the commander. Let's go ahead and set him back here and move into the 99. Mystic Sanctuary. It is an island, and it says when it ETBs, if you control, it enters the battlefield tapped unless you control 3 or more other islands. And when it enters untapped, you may put target instant or sorcery from your graveyard on top of your library. Very strong with Unesh because you can get back a Cyclonic Rift, or just a very important spell, play a Sphinx, pick the pile that has that card in it, and you're going to get what you need. It kind of tutors out of your graveyard in a sense, which is very strong. Teleria. I play this, or my wife plays this rather, for no other reason besides I think these Legends cards are super fun. I don't know. It's literally just a legendary land that makes a blue. The banding isn't super relevant, though there is a Kolvori God of Kinship deck in the meta that actually does play the land from Legends that says green legends have banding with other legends. So there is technically some banding in my meta, as funny as that is. But more than anything else, it's just an excuse to play this, this cool old card. Soldevi Excavations. Enters the battlefield, you sack an untapped island. Taps for 1 and a blue, and you can pay 1 and tap to scry 1. Path of Ancestry is going to be a land that lets us scry 1 when we cast a Sphinx. Myriad Landscape helps us ramp. Temple of the False God is a land I don't really like that much in Commander anymore, but in this deck it seems fine, just to give us the additional mana. Reliquary Tower is a must-have in this deck, and honestly, we could probably do with a few more no-max hand size effects than we have, because I think we just run this and Thought Vessel. I might be wrong. And then 28 islands. Into the mana ramp. Soul Ring needs no explanation. Wayfarer's Bauble allows us to actually ramp a land into play. If you're not playing a green deck, like if you're playing any commander deck and it's not green, seriously, you should be playing Wayfarer's Bauble. It is a genuinely amazing piece of ramp. If you drop it on turn 1, it's basically just a rampant growth, because turn 2, it's pay 2 and go find a basic. Sapphire Medallion, cost reducing our blue spells by 1 is insane, and also pairs really well with Unesh. Thought Vessel gives us no max hand size, and is a nice early game mana rock. Felwar Stone will almost always be a second copy of Arcane Signet in this deck, because, there's going to be another blue deck at the table. Let's be real. Cold Steel Heart enters tapped, but gives us a mana of any color, or mana of the chosen color when it ATBs. We're always going to choose blue, so it's basically just a second copy of Sky Diamond. Arcane Signet, even if you're in mono color, this is one of the best mana rocks, if not the best mana rock not named Soul Ring or Mox that you could be running. Herald's Horn. ETBs, we're going to choose Sphinx, and Sphinxes will cost 1 less to cast, and at the beginning of our upkeep, we can look at the top card of our library, and if it's a Sphinx, we get to draw it for free. Urza's Incubator, further cost reduction on our Sphinxes. Solemn Simulacrum is a staple in any non-green EDH deck. Thran Dynamo is a card you don't see in EDH a lot anymore. It used to be a big staple, but in these big mana tribal decks, I do still run Thran Dynamo and Gilded Lotus. So, and speaking of which, there's Gilded Lotus. Now moving into the Sphinxes. So Mirror Image. It's not a Sphinx, but it's a Sphinx. So it's a 3-mana clone that has to copy a thing of ours. That's completely okay because it means we're going to get to do the Unesh trigger on it. And getting a second copy of one of our big flying Sphinxes is just solid. Then we have Argent Sphinx, which is 4 mana for a 4/3 with Metalcraft. We'll almost always have Metalcraft due to how much ramp we run in the artifact department. And the Metalcraft is pay a blue to exile it until the end of turn. And then it comes back into play, obviously, which will re-trigger the Unesh. Curator of Mysteries. Oh, I'm getting a phone call. Let me just go ahead and ignore that. Whenever we cycle or discard a card, we scry 1, which is useful because if we don't have our No-Max hand size effect, we will be discarding a lot. So it kind of lets us stack our deck a little bit at that point in time in the game, and we can just cycle it away if we don't need it. By the way, we are using the blue, I forget what these are called, with the blue dragon sleeves from Dragon Shield on this deck. Master of Winds. ETBs, draw 2, discard 1, and when we cast an instant or sorcery, we can swap its power and toughness. That is actually irrelevant. What is relevant is in this deck, after Unesh is in play, this is 2 mana, draw 2, discard 1, and then mini Factor Fiction, which is insane card advantage. Conundrum Sphinx. It attacks, and each player names a card. Then each player reveals the top card of their library. If the named card is revealed, that player puts it into their hand. Otherwise, it goes to the bottom of the library. We have a few effects that kind of let us stack the deck in this deck, so we can kind of make sure we draw what we want. But more often than not, this is just an early curve Sphinx for the deck, because you don't want to have nothing but 6 drops. Sphinx of Foresight is a pre-game action if we have it in our opening hand, so you can reveal it in scry 3. Otherwise, it's a 4/4 flying that lets you scry 1 at the beginning of your upkeep. Prognostic Sphinx, pretty much jamming this for no other reason than I loved playing this in my Jeskai control deck back in Khans of Tarkir Standard, and I wanted to see this played somewhere, so it seemed like the perfect spot for it. Guardian of Nazim is landfall to tap a thing, but if it's a island, which it almost always will be, we frost tap a thing. Sphinx of Lost Truths, so it will actually cost, instead of 7 mana to kick this, it'll cost 5 mana to play this kick, thanks to Unesh. And that's how we're always going to do this. So it's going to enter the battlefield, and we're going to draw 3, and then we're going to mini Factor Fiction, which is nice. Dazzling Sphinx is a new one out of Commander 21. So when it deals combat damage to a player, I'll go ahead and zoom in on this a little bit. Oh, not that far. When it deals combat damage to a player, that player exiles the top card of their library, or exiles a card from the top card of from the top of their library until they exile an instant or sorcery. We can cast that card without paying its mana cost, and then put the exiled cards on the bottom of the owner's library in a random order. So it's just card advantage for us. Elegance says if we would scry a number of cards, we draw that many instead, which is insane. Sphinx of Enlightenment is going to ETB and draw us 3 cards, and let an opponent draw 1. And then, of course, the Unesh is going to mini Factor Fiction on top of all of that. Ormos Archive Keeper says if we would draw from an empty library, we instead put 5+1/+1 counters on it, so it keeps us from decking ourselves, and we can pay 1 and 2 blue, discard 3 cards with different names, and draw 5. You may laugh at this, but I have actually died to this in a 1v1 game against my wife. I had Lyra, she had Unesh, she was out of cards in her deck, and she doesn't run any of the Lab Maniac effects in this deck. She thinks those cards are kind of lame, she thinks they're kind of generic and boring, she sees them a lot, she doesn't like them. So instead, she opts to play this, and I actually did get beaten down with an Ormos that was just constantly getting bigger and smacking me in the face, despite the fact that I started that entire situation out with, I think, like 230 life because of the lifelink from Lyra. She was able to eventually get there with Ormos and keep counterspelling and removing my things to make sure that I didn't, wasn't able to threaten her. Attempsis All-Seeing, kind of Sphinx Exodia. Fun card. I will read this one out loud. I'm not going to read everything from this point on, but I'm going to read this one at least. 6 mana, 4/5, pay 2 and a blue and tap to draw 2 and discard 1. And when it deals combat damage to an opponent, we may reveal our hand. If we reveal at least 6 different converted mana costs this way, that player loses the game. Haven't gotten to see this win the game yet, but man, I am looking forward to it when it does happen. Windreader Sphinx is fantastic because it draws you a card when any flyer attacks, not just your own. Chancellor of the Spires lets you... It's also a pre-game action, but more importantly, it lets you cast an instant or sorcery from an opponent's yard without paying its mana cost. Enigma Thief. So, this is a 7-mana card, but it's really a 4-mana card, but it's really a 2-mana card because Unesh is going to cost reduce it. So, as long as we've hit with a Sphinx or Rogue, like it's a Sphinx, we can cast it for 4 mana, cost reduced by 2 to 2 mana. And it just bounces a non-land permanent to its owner's hand. So 2 mana 5/5 mini Factor Fiction bounce a thing seems very playable to me. Inspired Sphinx usually is ETB draw 3, and we can make some Thopters out of it. Sphinx of Enlightenment is enter the battlefield Factor Fiction, which with Unesh is enter the battlefield Factor Fiction and then mini Factor Fiction. Scholar of the Lost Trove. ETB, you can cast an instant sorcery or artifact from your graveyard without paying its mana cost, and if an instant or sorcery is cast this way, it's exiled instead, so it's kind of like the Phyrexian Sphinx, but for our own stuff. Sphinx of the Final Word just stops opponents from countering our instants and sorceries, which makes us win the counter war every time. And that is all the Sphinxes. Into the tutor package, Mystical Tutor, find an instant or sorcery, put it to top. Merchant Scroll, find a blue instant, put it to hand. Solve the Equation, find an instant or sorcery, put it to hand. Oh. And that is the only set of tutors we are running in this deck. Some card draw and cantrips. We have Preordain, Ponder, Rhystic Study. Those all give us a few cards, card selection or direct card advantage. Flood of Recollection, and Relearn to get instants or sorceries back to our hand from the graveyard. Some counterspells. We are running Swan Song. Nope, cards keep sliding here. Negate, Arcane Denial, Counterspell, Forbid, which is particularly nasty in this deck because you will always have those 2 cards to discard and buy this back, which means you can kind of get a soft lock on the game with Forbid. And Archmage's Charm, which can be a counterspell, or it can be a divination, or it can be gain a non-land power with CMC of 1 or less. It could be just gain Soul Ring. Some removal spells: Pongify, Rapid Hybridization, Reality Shift, which is particularly good because it's exile, Resculpt, which is like Reality Shift, but, even better because it can hit an artifact. Yeah, they get a 4/4. That doesn't really matter in this deck. It doesn't really matter in most decks. A 4/4 can put some level of pressure, but it's hardly relevant to the outcome of the game in my experience. Boomerang, to bounce any permanent to its owner's hand. And Raven Form, again hitting an artifact or a creature and giving them a 1/1. This is at sorcery speed, but it's still a fantastic piece of removal you should be running in your mono blue deck. Or in your blue decks that don't have access to green or white, because being able to hit artifacts is very important. Then we have Baral's Expertise. Bounce 3 target artifacts and or creatures to their owner's hand and cast a card with CMC 4 or less without paying its mana cost. If you're not trying out Baral's Expertise, give it a shot. Rishkar's Expertise is not the only expertise worth playing in this format. Cyclonic Rift, everyone knows Cyclonic Rift. Just bounce all the things that aren't your things. Whelming Wave, return everything to their owner's hand except for Krakens, Leviathans, Octopuses, and Serpents. We need more board wipes on mono blue, so we run it. Perplexing Test is one I'm a big fan of that just came out. We can either bounce all creature tokens or all non-creature tokens. So more often than not, this is instant speed, bounce all the non-tokens and save ourselves. But sometimes, when you're playing against the token decks, the Edgar Markovs, the Nagilas, the Hazazon Tamars, the Proshes, whatever, we can just blow them out by bouncing all of the tokens, which is really nice. Flood of Tears. Return all non-land permanents to their owner's hand, and if 4 or more non-token permanents are returned this way, you get to put a permanent card from your hand onto the battlefield, which is, genuinely decent. It's kind of a Cyclonic Rift that hits everyone, but it leaves you with something, kind of like an Expertise. Lazotep Plating is just really good protection. I've started playing this in a lot of decks. It is no heroic intervention, but giving indestructible and giving hexproof to your entire team, as well as yourself, is definitely relevant. The Amass one, not so much, but try out Lazotep Plating if you're not already. Crystal Shard lets us bounce the Sphinx back to our hand to replay it. Thassa Deep Dwelling and Conjurer's Closet just let us flicker a Sphinx at EOT. And Teferi Mage of Zalfir is in here because we can. No other reason. We could play it here, so we did. And that is the Unesh Criosphinx Sovereign deck of my wife's. She absolutely loves this deck. It was her first experience with a kind of typical blue deck, as far as her piloting it anyways, and She's not normally a big blue mage. She tends to prefer green and white, sometimes red. So this was a nice learning experience for her to figure out how other colors worked. And I would be lying if I said that I didn't lose to this deck quite frequently. This has blown me out more than once. It's just very hard to deal with that much card advantage coming from the blue player. So, that was this deck tech. Hope you guys enjoyed it. I hope you enjoyed the rest of your day. And until next time, peace and take care.